Hello lovers, my name is Mackenzie. Welcome to or welcome back to my channel. As you can see from the title and the screen, this video is about astrological goal planning. And I was initially going to be filming this around the new year, but spoiler alert, I don't really make resolutions or goals on the new year. Anything that I intend to do around the new year is really a continuation of something I decided on my birthday. And 1 month ago I had a birthday, and so it felt much more genuine to film this video after setting my own personal New Year's goals, as I call them. And so this is a method I've created, but this is more so a combination of different methods and techniques that I have seen work for me over time. And so if you already goal plan, then some of this might look familiar to you. And if you're an astrologer, then some of this might already be second nature for you. And regardless of your level of familiarity with either, I hope that this video provides a new perspective for you on both and the ways that they can work together. So yeah, let's dive in. So starting with why. Why do we do this? Why does any of this matter? I have found that more intentionally aligning my goal planning practice, which is one thing, with my astrological practice, another thing, makes for both being healthier. It gives me a broader sense of time and a sense of ability with what I can do in a certain amount of time based on more realistic standards and expectations. And it also, through time, I have found that beginnings matter. When we choose to do things matters. And I personally don't really focus on New Year's resolutions because the new year is for everybody. And you might have some really epic transits happening around a new year, but more broadly, New Year's are for everyone. And your birthday is yours, and it's your personal new year. That is a phrase that I have been using for longer than I realized the depth of, and it's something that I take very seriously because it's yours. It's specific to you, it's personal. And so that is why I both value birthdays more than regular New Year's, and also one of the foundational points in the method that I use. And also one of the big whys is that it's fun to do things. It's fun to make goals and dream big. And when we can take something that's really fun, that should be really fun, and have it more well-informed, then it can be even more fun. And in my life, I value fun. So that's one reason that this method has come into being. So let's get nitty gritty with it. This is the process. So it looks really complicated, probably written out like this in 10 steps, but it's like really not that complicated, like I promise. So I would highly recommend screenshotting this. I'm going to reference this as we go through, but this is the rough 1 through 10 boiled down to what we're going to be looking at. So let's just go ahead and dive into it. So number 1 is journaling. Journaling to reflect on the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the ugly from any last period of time. So I personally do this always once a year on my birthday. I also like to do this at the 6-month, like halfway check-in point. That generally works best for me. And then around the quarters, I will kind of like look back and then maybe like do a small little like addendum of sorts. But this is not a process that I do monthly. That would be ridiculous. If you would like to do that, more power to you. But that's not my life. And so I have found that annually is like the long one that I spend generally a couple days doing because I want to sleep on it and really reflect. And then every 6 month I'll do like, a couple hour type situation. And truthfully, I can't tell you how to journal. I like to journal just stream of thought process, I really like using voice to text when I journal. If you have a device that is capable of doing voice to text, I find that that stream of consciousness just from your voice is sometimes more fluid than written. However, I also like to handwrite as well. Mind mapping is also pretty awesome, just circles of thoughts and bubbles and how they lead. And the reason that I want to start with journaling is because this is where you reflect. This is where you're thinking about the last either 6 months or a year. You think about what went awesome, what didn't go so awesome, and really diving into how you felt about all of those things. Because it's not just this was good and this was bad. It's the whys. It's the nuances of your life and the intricacies of your days and all of the memories that contribute to your reflection. And so whatever shape it takes, this step is like cannot be avoided and it cannot be skipped over in any means. And from the very beginning, this is a method that requires discernment. I guess spoiler alert, if you were coming for a video that told you exactly how to do something and like wanted you to follow it exactly, then this is probably not for you, because this method requires discernment because there is choice involved here. Making a goal is making a choice, and being further particular and specific about how you make that choice requires even more discernment. And so this is a method for you, but you have to decide how your journey takes shape. And so from the beginning, what your journaling looks like, who knows? And so do it. It's important. Don't skip over it and don't rush it, because how you feel on the other side of that reflection will inform how you move forward. So next we go into, I'm calling it portions of the pie, because this is number 2, which is grouping life into manageable categories. And so how you want to divide your life up is really your choice. There are a lot of people in the goal planning circles that use level 10 life, or I've seen different variations of the major 5, major 7, major 9, as in major categories of your life, etc., etc. There's really any number. That is all fine and well if you use that method and it works for you. If you have certain life categories that you always work with, that's great. I might also suggest astrologically categorizing. For a while, I used planets. One major signifier of Jupiter is wealth. And so at times when I was very, very worried about money, I would petition with Jupiter, work with Jupiter. I would think about Jupiter when making my goals. There was a period of time when I was like very seriously getting a lot of tattoos. Tattoos can signify a lot of different things, but for me, my purpose was beauty. So that was Venus. And so I did a lot of like Venus goal setting with that. And so those are just examples. I don't use a planet structure anymore. At this point, I use a house structure. And so this is a very rough example of some words that I have used over time to signify the categories of my life. And so using all of the 12 houses, I have rough sort of goals or goal categories for each. And this will look different for you based on your life. So don't think that this is what you have to do or what is expected, but this is just showing you that there are options as to how you categorize things. And also, this is just letting y'all know, don't listen to all of those online lists of categories, because a lot of those lists include shit that's not at all relevant to you, depending on what your life is like. So think of how you want to group things off, how it feels natural, and then run from there. So now, number 3, affirming how you want to feel in each category. So what this means is take however many categories of life you have and give them all some space. And then underneath each one, I suggest actually writing, I want to feel, and then listing. And then just stream of consciousness pouring out how you want to feel. An example of this is Whenever I make financial goals, words that always come up are safe and secure. And so a lot of my journaling for that category of my life is literally just those two words. I want to feel safe and secure. And those are my financial goals in a lot of ways. And so for all of these categories, going through how you want to feel, what you want to feel, and also why. And I want to have a moment here to say that it's very important that you don't think about how you want to feel based on anyone else's expectations, any other person's expectations, or societal expectations. This is not saying, like, for example, physically, I want to feel beautiful. Beautiful is a wonderful feeling. I would caution that you make sure you're not wanting to feel beautiful in order for other people to see you as beautiful. There is a difference between wanting to feel beautiful because you find yourself beautiful and you feel that way about yourself versus wanting to feel beautiful as decided by others. And so this is why I included the and why question to this slide, because it's a very important factor. Because when you're setting your goals, when you're deciding what the fuck you want to do with your life, you have to remove any expectations or like anything that has been put upon you by something else or somebody else. And you have to think about what you want. Because if you're thinking about what other people want, you're not going to be setting goals that are aligned with your actual purpose. You're not going to be doing what's right for you because you're going to be thinking about what's right for everyone else. And so this step is really the permission slip to decide what you want and not feel bad about it. And so you really have to look at your own benchmarks of success, at your own standards of success, and your own decisions on how you want to feel, and move forward with a really clear head and a clear headspace with no one else's sort of perceptions being cast upon that. And staying here, now we are on to number 4, which is finding the overarching patterns of dreamy feelings and focus on the loudest. And so what I do during this step is I go through my categories and I go through my lists that I've made, and I highlight the words that are loudest. I highlight the ones that are screaming at me. I highlight the ones that are similar, and I highlight the ones that are showing up in multiple categories, because those are definitely really loud. And so this is very literally when you pick the words. And I suggest keeping this as small as possible. You can have a shit ton of them if you want, but the next step involves like writing them down and keeping them visible. So a shit ton maybe isn't the most, reasonable, but what's reasonable to you is reasonable. So own that. And so this step is finding what is continuing to move throughout all of your categories, feelings that transcend a part of your life and they are evocative of what you want your overall life to be. Because yes, we break down our life into categories to, have a broader view and to be able to look at things more widely. But at the end of the day, when we make a goal, it is a life goal that is going to apply to everything. And so breaking things down to put them back together is a big, big part of this puzzle. So go through, find your feelings, pick them out, reduce them down, maybe condense them, find the few, the handful or 2 handfuls that really, really resonate with you. And then on to number 5, leading from those feelings in order to set dreamy goals. We want dreamy feelings, and we also want dreamy goals to follow. And so this is where you actually prioritize those feelings and then place them higher than anything else. You place your feelings higher than anything else. Because when we feel good, things follow that are good. And it's not always easy to feel good, and it's not always possible to feel good all the time. However, looking for that state of feeling, that constant, whether it's joy or happiness or content or peace, that overarching thing that we can just stay at, and prioritize that. And as far as joy, happiness, peace, all of those, do not think that any of those are too basic or too trivial. That is actually a perfect feeling to strive for. My only encouragement would to be maybe get as specific as possible. Maybe your ideal feeling might be happiness, or it might be exhilaration. And that's just an example of how the difference in description can really provide nuance and more specificity to your specific feeling. And so now at step 5, about halfway through, now is when you kind of start thinking about those goals. You start thinking about what you want to do. You start thinking, all right, these are the juicy feelings that I have. These are the juicy, dreamy, amazing feelings. And now, how would those feelings be manifested? How could those come into life? And so this is when you start really thinking about what those goals might be. And if you're not totally sure, then that's okay, because the next 5 steps are gonna help inform your goals as well. And you might get on step like 8 or 9 and be like, oh my gosh, there's the goal and it fits perfectly. And so be patient. It's not all gonna happen at the same time. So now we're gonna go on to a slightly busy slide, but stay with me here. This is number 6, which is deciding on a realistic timeline. And so I'm gonna focus on this chart for a second and this graph over here, so that we only have one on the screen. And I'm showing a condensed version of my own birth chart, shown in whole sign houses with the lunar cycle around it. And so this step of deciding on a realistic timeline is asking you the question of what season of life are you in? And when I'm looking at my life and looking at what season of life I'm in, I always come back to the elegance of the lunar cycle. And I see the full moon as this peak point in fullness, this open, bright, visible space. And I find that to be beautifully similar to the midheaven in the chart, the highest point in the birth chart in the sky at that time. And in the opposite side, we have the new moon, the darkest point when the sky is completely pitch black and the moon and the sun are meeting together and you cannot see the moon. And I find that to be very closely similar to the IC in the chart, which is the darkest, deepest point of the bottom of the earth at the chart. And so I also want to talk a moment about angularity. So angularity in the whole sign house chart, I have shown the ascendant-descendant axis and the MC-IC axis. And angularity is referring to the angles. And I'm going to move over here to a quadrant house system chart. This is shown in porphyry. I generally use whole sign houses for just about everything, but I have very much lately been looking at porphyry as an overlay. I've looked at other quadrant house systems. I personally have just been really vibing with porphyry. That's a personal decision. And in this chart, you can see the ascendant and the midheaven with the 2 arrows, and then descendant I see on the opposites. And so whatever you decide to choose as your highest point matters to you. This is not going to be an argument about house division. Literally back to the portions of pie, you can slice it a lot of different ways. And so there's not a right or wrong way. Use what you want to use, but it will change your potential highest point, especially for someone with the midheaven in the 11th or the 9th house by whole sign houses. My midheaven is at the very end of my 10th whole sign house. So, for example, if this was your chart, for example, you could be considering your full moon peak moment to be at the beginning of your 10th house season or when your midheaven season starts. And how we determine the season, I'm going to get to in a sec. At the very bottom here, I wanted to put some general keywords for the lunar cycle and the different phases. And so take with that what you will about the angles in your chart. And I do want to say here for a moment that I strongly suggest always using the angles in your chart. With that being said, and I mean that as far as timing techniques and as far as what you consider to be your cycle and your seasons of your life. But with that being said, I always suggest using the angles unless you have the malefic out of sect in the angles and there's basically like no mitigation, no help at all. And what I mean by that is if you have, I'm going to go on a short little tangent about sect. If you know this, then you know this. If you don't, this might be a lot, but breathe with me. If your birth chart is a day chart, meaning the sun is in the top half of your chart, you were born during the day, you were born when the sun was in the sky above the horizon, then the most difficult planet in your chart, the malefic out of sect, is Mars. And if you were born with the sun underneath the horizon, you were born at nighttime, the most difficult planet in your chart and the malefic out of sect for you is Saturn. And so if you have the malefic out of sect on an angle or very close to an angle or in an angular house by whole sign houses, depending on what system you use, that is one of the only times that I would really reconsider using the angles, along with the fact that there's no mitigation, no help at all. Like if it's a very well aspected and if it's in domicile, then maybe it's okay. But if it's like very, very seriously struggling, then I would consider maybe not using the angles. In that case, my personal backup for the angles is looking at your sect light. Meaning if you were born during the day, look for where your sun is. If you were born at night, look for where your moon is, because that is your sect light. The sun and the moon are the lights. That's your luminary, your light of your sect. And so if your angles are severely compromised with a malefic that has no help, then I would look at one of your lights. If one of your lights is in a really bad position, then look at the other light. And then in the only other scenarios that I really consider would be potentially the lot of fortune or the lot of spirit, but I really suggest not using that because the fortune and spirit are calculated with the sun and the moon and the ascendant. And so I always really want to use the ascendant and the angles or one of the lights if it is possible. And so keep that in mind. That is up to your discernment based on the condition of your chart, based on the condition of your planets and where they're placed. And so keeping that in mind and looking at these general signifiers, these can be the seasons of life that you're in. These can be phases of a project. These can be phases of anything in your life. Everything in our life is constantly on a cyclical phase, and most things are not lined up at the same time. And so it's keeping in mind that there are different speeds and different frequencies that things are moving at. And so using angles or the lights, determining when your personal full moon peak season is going to be very personal to you. Also something that I have potentially played with, I didn't want to include it here to be confusing, but I will mention it, is using the full moon peak at your ascendant. And so full moon peak at your ascendant, I personally think that the midheaven works more reliably though, especially in the full cycle phase. So keeping that in mind, moving on to number 7, which is breaking down goals into smaller steps. And so this is the next sort of phase of this, which is within this cycle, there are different speeds and there are different movements. So you can think of this full moon peak season as being the sun sign season when the sun moves through this place. Or you can think of this being a more quick lunar cycle when the moon comes to that highest place in your chart. You can use other planets as well, but I highly suggest using the lights. The lights I have found to be the most consistent and reliable because they are the most consistent and reliable movements in the sky. Other planetary cycles can be consistent and reliable as well, but the moon and the sun are the most constant, and they are historically what humans have used to tell time and to discern what's happening. And so the sun and the moon, their importance can never be overstated as the light bringing sources in the sky. And so these charts are mildly different because they're from both of these charts are from AstroGold, but this is from the way that I have it on my computer. This is from the way that I have it on my phone, because on my phone I like having the decans. That's just personal taste. And so this is the photo of my most recent solar return chart. And so I like looking at the solar return for long-ish term. And I'm saying long-ish term here because time really isn't that linear. And so what is long or short term is very relative. And so just keep that in mind. And then I also have a photo of my most recent lunar return, looking at lunar returns for short-ish. And then keeping both of these in mind, deciding on the timeline and then breaking it down into, maybe you have a goal that you think is like a year-long goal, but you realize that goal has incremental small steps. And that's where we can really implement the lunar returns to kind of see that short-term perspective versus the long-term perspective. And now let's keep going. Number 8 is aligning our goals and those steps towards our goals with the timeline. And the timeline, I personally use as perfection years. And so this perfection years wheel is from Chris Brennan's book, Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune. And if you do not know what perfections, if you do know what perfections are, just ride with me. If you don't know what perfections are, let's go a little crash course here. So this is a Time Lord technique from the Hellenistic tradition where you are finding the Time Lord of your year. And so, for example, when you were born, you entered a first house year. And because that was the first year of your life. And so it's always 1 year behind, which is initially very confusing, but when you remember it, you can remember it. And it goes every year of your life gets one house, and then it continues in that wheel. So the multiples of 12 are always going to be first house years because they run around in the 12th or in the 12 houses, And so you can follow all the way through. Perfections is one of the most simple, but arguably one of the most elegant techniques. And I personally use it maybe more than any other technique because you can split this into years, but you can also split this into months. And so, for example, if you were in a 6th house year, if your birthday happened and you began a 6th house year, that first month is going to be a 6th house year, 6th house month. And then you continue all the way through. And so, I think I said that correctly. Let's hope I didn't fuck that up. Okay, let's just keep writing. And so, basically, when you look at this perfections wheel, you layer your natal chart on it. And so if you're going with that example, if you just began a 6th house year and your 6th house was Leo, then that means you began a Leo year, a 6th house year that was ruled by Leo, which is also ruled by the sun. So if your 6th house is Leo, then your 6th house is ruled by the sun. And so you are in a 6th house year that is ruled by the sun, which incorporates both meanings of the 6th house as a house, and also the sun as a planet. And so both of those together can reflect on both of these layers. And so going back and forth for a sec, you want to think about all the different layers that can happen here. For example, if you enter we're just going to ride with this example. If you enter a 6th house Leo year, and you look at your solar return chart, you want to see, okay, does the solar return chart have any specific aspects to Leo, or is it making any very specific motions to it? I'm going to use my own personal example here because it is relevant and real life examples are always good. As you can see from my natal chart, I have a Sagittarius rising. And the birthday that I just had, I entered a third house year, which is the second of 2 Saturn years. And so my third house is ruled by Aquarius. And so I have a Saturn third house. You can't see it on here, but my Saturn is in the 5th house. And when using perfections, I will say I prefer using whole sign houses because it's exactly 1 house per sign. And so if you're layering a quadrant house on top of that, that's perfectly fine. But the technique really does need whole sign houses. And so I entered a 3rd house year, and my 3rd house, Saturn, my 3rd house Aquarius is ruled by my Saturn in the 5th. And so if you look at my solar return chart, I actually have Aries, my 5th house, on the ascendant. And so that was one layer of things already lining up that, okay, my 3rd house is activated, but that also means Saturn is activated. And Saturn is in my 5th. And in my solar return chart, my 5th house is on the ascendant. And so that is already showing ties between those 2 house topics in ways that just a strict perfections would not necessarily see. And so all of these factors combined can help you figure out what sort of parts of your life are going to be the most highlighted. And this is one of the reasons that the categories of life being split up by houses, I personally find to be really, really powerful for this technique. If you can't make essentially a category for each house, or if that seems like way too many for you, then condense them if need be. I will say that this is very helpful for this particular integration because looking at solar returns and also just lunar returns and perfections, you can see if there are a couple houses and therefore a couple categories of your life that are gonna be really loud. And so for example, for me, my 3rd house, or the life category that I put with my 3rd house, is my mental, which for me is looking like a lot of writing. I am already writing a lot in my 3rd house here, more than I expected to. And I kind of anticipated this happening, but it was still a bit of a surprise. And so also my 5th house category of joy, the 5th house is just pleasure and just goodness. And I'm writing about things that I love to do, things that bring me joy. And so this is already a 3rd and 5th house overlap that was showing up in my perfections, in my solar return, but that looking at my categories and my goals in life, I can now see, okay, this is what's happening. Maybe this is something I want to focus on. Maybe this is something I want to make an actual goal towards and really focus on in this year or in this next 6 months or in whatever time period you choose. And I should also point out that it is very important to look at transits. And I think that is our next step, which this is on to step number 9, which is setting realistic expectations for if and when the timeline doesn't happen exactly as you planned. Because there are a lot of other layers. So as far as astrological layers, I've already mentioned some of these, but the transiting planets and like what the fuck's going on at the sky at the time is always important to pay attention to. And so we cannot forget that there are constantly moving planets in the sky and that any of our solar and lunar returns are moments happening right now. And they're just snapshots. The sky is continuing to move and continuing to highlight things and set them off. And so it's important to always look at what's happening. And so, as mentioned, the solar lunar return ascendant and which house that is natally. Oh, also I forgot to highlight this other point. So my most recent lunar return. So the lunar return that is during my birthday. So this is a smaller, I wouldn't say technique, but just an important thing to note. When it is your birthday season, so your sun sign season, finding the alignment that the sun and the moon were making at the time of your birth, the degrees might not be exact, and that happens. But finding the sun where it was at the time of your birth and finding the moon in the phase and sign that it was at the time you were born is super important to look at. And so this is the most recent solar return, or most recent lunar return for me after my solar return. And it puts the moon in the first house. And interestingly, this is my solar return, which has the 5th house, and that's Aries. But my most recent lunar return had Scorpio, and both of those are ruled by Mars. And so my Mars rules my 5th house. And so that's another alignment of like, all right. And so for me personally, I kind of coined this year as a lot of malefic work because I have a perfection ruled by a malefic. And that malefic is in the house, in the place of another malefic, which is clearly very activated as well. And so solar and lunar return and the ascendant in which house that is natally, a super important layer to keep in mind. Along with your perfected house and your annual Time Lord specific transits. So this will be slightly easier if it's Jupiter or Saturn because they move slower, but looking at where your Time Lord moves and what they're doing. So if your Time Lord for the year is the moon, if you're in a Cancer perfection, you're going to be very closely looking at the moon. And that's going to be a lot of movement. Whereas me, I'm in a Saturn year right now. And so Saturn is moving much slower, but it's still important to keep in mind. Along with other timing techniques that I'm not going to go into here, such as zodiacal releasing, Fodaria, planetary decades or decennials, etc., 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 because this is where the discernment is extra important. Because if you're an astrologer, you have a favorite timing technique. You probably knew your favorite timing technique and you were thinking about it from the moment I started talking about timing. And also keep in mind that if you're not an astrologer and you don't know any of this stuff, that's totally okay too. Along with personal layers, you might have made plans a year or two ago for something, or somebody might have planned an event that you literally can't miss. And that might get in the way of your timeline. There might be sensitive holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, etc. that aren't going to be really potent times for you to be visible or to be working towards a goal. These might be times that you're literally just trying to survive. And you have to be realistic with yourself, along with any number of factors that can exist outside linear time that are not listed here, specifically grief. As someone who has lost a loved one and who regularly feels shaken and torn down by grief at the drop of a hat, I have come to recognize that there is an extreme amount of patience that I must give myself and that I deserve to give myself, because not everything is going to work on a timeline, even though it would be amazing if everything perfectly did. And so the astrological layers are for the techniques and for the exactness and for setting the plans. And the personal layers are for the reality and the messiness of life and all of the ways that it really can't always be pinned down perfectly. And that leads me to step 10, which is the technical last step, which I'm titling the oh fuck alternative, which is having an emergency recovery burnout plan. And so for me, my personal solution is always sleeping and forgiving myself for trying to do too much and for trying to do more than my body is capable of doing. And this step is not bad. This step makes you human. And when you're setting goals, when you're making plans, when you're setting intentions, any of that, you have to have grace for yourself. Because I have never met a single person who accomplished every single one of their goals on the exact timeline that they anticipated. And if I did, I would probably tell them that they were insane and that maybe they needed to be spending more quality time doing fun shit, because it's not realistic to be perfect all the time. And that's why this is a method. That's why this is a guideline. That's why this is something that I actively follow and work with and still don't get perfect, because sometimes I set goals and I don't finish them on the timeline expected, and they end up being finished a couple days or a week or a month later, and that's okay. And your life changes. The conditions in your life change. And dependent on all of these layers, things might change that you have absolutely no control of. And you can't be upset about that. I mean, that's easier said than done, because it's easier to, kind of thrash about it. But you have to just breathe and you have to let yourself process. And once you do process, it's going to feel much more nice to think about what things could be like. And so this is the reminder to have grace for yourself, have love for yourself, and do not push yourself too far. And on this note, I will go ahead and give some, I think, last minute tips, which is, let's go back a few slides here. We're just going to go through fast. Those words that you picked, seriously write them down. Whether you write them down daily or weekly, or whether you just write them down and put them somewhere so that you see them, the way that you want to feel is the most important part of this step, honestly. Not this step, but this method. The way that you want to feel should permeate your life. And oftentimes we get in this rat race feeling of, I'm just setting goals and setting goals and setting goals. And once I accomplish this goal, I'm going to feel some type of way. Once I do this thing, I'm going to feel better. Once I achieve this, I'll have the feeling that I want. And that rat race capitalist mentality is removing the importance of the feelings themselves. Because if we're accomplishing goals, doing all this cool shit, if we still feel like garbage, that means that the goals were not aligned with us to begin with. And that is a problem. And so whether you put it on a mirror, whether you put it on your desk, whether you rewrite it in your planner every week, whatever the fuck it takes, put those feelings somewhere you're going to see them, and cement them into your soul in some way. And from those feelings, those goals that you picked, if they start feeling not aligned, if it starts feeling like you have put too much on your plate, if it starts to feel like you are forcing something, then scrap the goals. Just throw out the goals. If you had a great grand plan, if you were I had the feelings, everything was great, I knew I had set the goals, everything was great, but then something went wrong, don't feel guilty about it. You're allowed to change your mind. Changing your mind makes you human in so many ways. And having changes of heart as new things come to light is vital to adaptation and growth. And you might look back on your goals that you made last year and be like, wow, I didn't accomplish half of those. And thank goodness I didn't. So allow yourself to have those moments without feeling guilty. And also, one way to help that is to review your notes and your goals often by actually looking at them and continuing to make notes on the small steps that contribute to your goals and really check in with how you're feeling. And this is why I generally like to check in quarterly to do a little note take, but every month I really do a little mental check-in, even if I don't write anything. And that is one reason that I also personally use monthly perfections, because it gives a good start of the month fresh feeling. And I say start of the month even though it's not the beginning of the month, because your perfection month starts on the day of your birthday. And so if your birthday is in the middle of the month, the 15th or 16th, then that's going to be the next month for you, is the next full month from 15th to 15th or whatever the day might be. And so continuing to check in is important, because if you just set a goal and you're my big lofty goal is out there, I'm going to do it, that's going to feel unattainable. And I will also recommend, if you are astrologically inclined, I would suggest getting a honeycomb almanac from the Honeycomb Collective. This is a personal astrological almanac, and it is a infinitely valuable tool on tracking transits, long-term and short-term. And I personally, you can see very specific transits happening on the month, like with your time zone, everything. This is an extremely valuable tool for tracking mundane transits, for tracking personal transits, and it really helps. And along with the like journaling and the checking in, I like using this planner for that. I don't personally use this planner to like plan my days. I use it as more of a long-term kind of goal planner. And so I generally make a lot of my notes about goals and about like my check-ins, monthly, quarterly, whatever. I make it in my astrological almanac. And so I obviously have mine digital because I can zoom in on it right here. But they do make physical ones that you can get and print out if you're more of an analog person. I use my Apple Pencil to write, but I just have been preferring more and more to be able to write digitally so that it's all in one place and so that I don't use as much paper. So the only last thing that I really wanted to touch on is to let yourself have fun. Goals aren't supposed to be stressful, and they end up being stressful a lot of the times, but they're supposed to be exciting and thrilling and somewhat nerve-wracking, because putting yourself out there can be really nerve-wracking, but it's worth it. And it's really worth it to go for your dreams. And that sounds fucking cheesy. Like, it does. It sounds kind of like real lame and like Hallmark movie type vibes. But it's really worth it. And it really allows you to step out of your comfort zone. And it really allows you to think about your potential and to dream about what's possible. And that's a really awesome place to be in when you allow yourself to relish in it. So I want to finish with some resources and inspiration. If you liked literally anything that I had to say, you will probably like what these people have to say in some way, shape, or form. First is Jo. Jo is the like supreme source on this. Should cite her entire brain, honestly, but specifically the 3 articles from her website, the life change list, the tracking one, and the intro to perfections. Jo is a wonderful person, a wonderful astrologer, and one of my all-time favorite people to talk about literally anything with. So yeah, Jo is supreme on this. And then very specific things throughout this method were informed by and further given perspective on from these 3 talks at NORWAC that I heard and listened to. NORWAC was fucking amazing. Oh, there's a typo there. I didn't see that. Rip. Okay, so Pallas and their work on planetary cycles, specifically their talk from NORWAC called Finding the Thread. Drew Levanti, I don't know why there's an N-E on that, Drew Levanti, and his work on electional astrology, specifically his talk on radical elections. And Kira Sutherland and her work on medical astrology, specifically her talk from NORWAC called Seeking Health. I believe that all 3 of these talks are available on the individual astrologer's website, and you can buy them on NORWAC's website, but I always recommend supporting the individual astrologers and buying them from them individually. Also, inspiration from this is the book by Danielle Laporte called The Desire Map. I followed that very strictly for about 1.5 years after I bought the book, and then I immediately started deviating because I wanted to incorporate astrology into it, but the methodology at the very beginning of this is heavily drawn on from that, but it is very much condensed. And then also Chris Brennan, Demetra George, Kelly Surtees, and Austin Coppock. These are 4 absolute just beasts in traditional astrology. Chris's book is the one that I referenced from the Perfections chart. Demetra's book is also, well, both of her books now actually are amazing sources for traditional astrological texts. And also Kelly Surtees and Austin Coppock, along with Chris Brennan, have done incredible work on the Astrology podcast. You can listen to that like anywhere. But the podcast is absolutely incredible and has done so much just in the widespread information. And so, yeah, I believe that that is all that I wanted to say here. I think that I'm finishing up. Oh my gosh. Oh, one thing else that I wanted to add here is that the waxing phase of the moon versus the waning phase of the moon and the waning and waxing phases and seasons of your life are cyclical. And I know I kind of touched on this, but I do at the very end here want to continue to emphasize that life comes in cycles. And the beginning versus the end, there's really only one beginning and end, which is birth and death, not to be morbid, but there are repetitive cycles that are happening in your life at all times. And so if you feel like you're in a more introverted time, if you're not feeling like you're wanting to be super public with goals or going for things or being seen or visible, you might just be in a waning phase, and that's okay. And if you're feeling like super loud, super vibrant, like you're doing so many things, you're writing so many things, you're publishing so many things, you're going for so many things, and you might be in a waxing phase. You might just be doing a lot, and you can't feel bad about that. And so these cycles come and go. And so it's important to remember that as they come and go, your motivation will come and go as well. And so allow that to happen, allow that to be natural, and allow yourself to flow with time. And as many different versions of time and layers of time that can be given, there is an intuitive feeling and a deep knowingness when the time has come. And I will leave with that. I hope that you enjoyed this. This definitely ended up being longer than I wanted it to be, or anticipated it being at all, but we're flowing with time, and that's on living the moment and living the lessons. And yeah, if you liked this video, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please comment and give me your thoughts on this. If you use this, if you incorporate any of this, please comment after the fact or email me. I want to hear feedback about this. I've done this in my life for going on 2.5, almost 3 years now, actually. I've been using this framework, and I've started incorporating it into my client practice and slowly talking to clients about it. And I love it. And it's seems somewhat simple if you're well versed in the astrological techniques, but it feels very elegant and it feels very purposeful. And so yeah, I really want feedback, and of course, like and share. I would love for more people to hear this, because I want as much feedback as possible. And if you liked this video, then of course subscribe to my channel. I have plenty of thoughts about plenty of things, and who knows when they will emerge, because I'm allowing not linear time to decide when things want to come. But please subscribe for more, and yeah. Thank you so much for watching, and I will hope to see you in the next one. And yeah, thank you so much.